Disclaimer: the views expressed on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. The content of the conversation is not reflective of the institutions or establishments mentioned therein. Take all these opinions with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime if needed. Hey Zoe, how's it going?
Hey Prateek, I'm doing good. Very excited to chat with you today.
Oh yeah, same here, same here. I'm glad we are able to do this, and thank you so much for taking the time. Before we get started, if you could let everybody know who you are, what you do, hobbies, passions, aspirations, likes, dislikes, anything and everything you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, that's cool. So, hello, Internet. My name is Zoe, and I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. I study advertising and I specialize in media and analytics. And on the side, I'm just kind of a couch potato. You know, going to grad school takes a lot out of you, but I do a lot of work in advertising, do a lot of student projects. And previously, I used to do a lot of things with diversity groups. So, like Asian American students, I ran a YouTube channel and stuff. So, that is just a little bit about me.
Cool, cool. Um, what was that switch like for you from graduating from undergrad to going to graduate school? And how long did it take you to sort of settle in?
So I knew I wanted to go to graduate school as soon as my senior year started because I took so many AP exams in high school that I managed to graduate undergrad in 3 years with 2 degrees, which is really great, unless you don't know what you're doing with your life. So I'm like, oh shit. So I applied for my master's programs. I looked into it over the summer, applied in the winter, and then of course COVID hit, and I was more panicked. But then I settled on UT Austin just because it was the number one program at the time. It was really affordable. And then moved in the middle of a pandemic in the summer to Austin by myself, which is kind of crazy because it's the very first time I was living alone in a really big city that's very different from Edmond, Oklahoma. And it's even crazier because after moving, the whole year was online, and I was like, great, great. I love spending money on rent, even though I didn't need to be here. And the first year was kind of a struggle, you know. It's like figuring out how do I read 100 plus pages of research and do an art project at the same time. And at the time, I was interning as well from like 8 to 5 every day, so I was losing my mind to say the least. But I think it's like as the weeks went on, I started getting a better flow of things, and now in my second year, I think I figured it out. I haven't had a mental breakdown yet.
Cool. Hey, that's always good. And you're in some sense of control, because I don't think you can ever be in full control, maybe, but having some sense of control definitely goes a long way. And what was that like moving around in a pandemic? Or wait, okay, so let me backtrack a little. Did you already get admission into a university before the pandemic hit, or what was
So
that like? Or was it during the pandemic that happened?
it was during the pandemic. So the timeline typically for graduate schools in like my kind of industry is you apply anywhere from November to December, and then you get the decisions back generally around like spring break. And so I won during the spring semester when COVID hit. I was like, am I going to get into grad school? And if not, how the heck am I going to find a job in the middle of a pandemic? And then as soon as I received my decisions, virtually I got into every single school and program I applied to. It was, where do I go that's safe? Where do I go that's affordable? And where do I go where the COVID response was well put together? So that's kind of how I decided on UT Austin out of all the schools I went to.
Gotcha. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, no, I mean, knowing you've sort of seen you juggle many things, and you mentioned the same thing again, doing research, art projects, interning. Um, you said that you tend to lose your mind, but you somehow get tend to get it all done. So, how do you strike that balance, or how does the brain inside Zoe's head work when it comes to tackling tasks in that sense?
Well, it feels like everything is on fire all the time. I'm always very panicked on the inside. But I know not everyone is like this, but I am very naturally very type A, and I'm also a workaholic. I enjoy being busy and doing things for others. And so, because I'm so organized, it's just setting priorities. What needs to get done first? Who do I need to talk to? And also understanding that you as a person don't have to do everything on your own. Oftentimes we're in team projects. When you intern, you have a team of coworkers. And so just keeping everyone in the loop of what your stress levels are, if you have other commitments, and asking them to cover certain tasks instead of doing everything on your own, I think has helped me a lot. And I will admit, I'm not very good at balancing. I just tend to work myself to death. And so I have like a good set of friends who yell at me, like, Zoe, are you eating? Did you sleep today? So it's kind of also having an outside group from the activities that you do to like keep you in check, if that makes sense.
For sure, yeah, for sure. Because you always need someone around you or some people around you who can always keep you in check in terms of making sure that you're taking care of yourself as well. Because you don't want to run yourself down to the ground and then not be able to do anything. So
Yeah, that's
that's
right.
definitely important.
And I always
Right,
tell people
right.
that like it takes one Zoe to run the world, but it takes like a whole village to run a Zoe to keep me accountable and alive. So even though I'm capable of doing so much, it takes more manpower to keep me in check.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. So, in terms of being like that, able like that ability to sort of work and get things done, and you said you're quite a Type A person, so it came to you naturally.
Mhm.
Was a lot of it also realization in terms of knowing, okay, this is how much I can tackle? Because a lot of the times, I guess you never know until you try, but once you try, you sort of know your capabilities and your boundaries. So, what was that mental switch, or like how's the many different thoughts in your brain firing in terms of, okay, this is how much I can handle, or maybe I can't, maybe this is something I need to delegate? So
Mhm.
how did all of those things sort of gradually fall into place?
Uh, I'm not gonna lie, it kind of comes with age because I used to be a lot younger, a lot more energy, and so I could do everything on my own. And you know, you always have teammates who end up being slackers. It's just very natural. And so I was like, okay, I'll carry it. I'll do everything. Like, if you can't do something or you're incompetent, I will take care of it and figure out the best solution. But as time went on, I think especially in grad school, because I'm so willing to do everything to make sure it's done well, I kind of became a pushover. And actually, last December, I had like one final group project where um, the teammates didn't do things correctly, and I was just at my burning point. I had done so much for the whole semester. And when the professor told us we had done it wrong, I just broke down crying. And that's when I kind of figured out, like, okay, how do I have a stronger voice and be able to delegate things better in the future? And it also comes with being a very ambitious person naturally. You knew me when I was at UCO for undergrad. So when I was planning like 20 programs in the spring for Asian Heritage Month, it became a realization that a big project requires a big team, and delegating that work to make the end product happen was more important to me than taking credit for everything, if that makes sense.
Definitely, definitely. You make quite an interesting point that I'd like to maybe touch on a little later. But
Mhm.
uh, first question, or not first question, but a question that popped up into my head rather is: are you a bit of a control freak?
Yeah, I've learned to let it go a little bit more. I've been more spontaneous since I've gotten to graduate school, but I am like a very like, why is everyone not on schedule? Why is no one answering? Like, why aren't things done this way? So it definitely comes from being in a very strict family, I think. So yes, I do have the control desire in me.
Oh yeah, I can relate to that totally because I've had moments where I also felt like the world is burning when nobody's doing their tasks in hand, or nobody's doing what they're supposed to do, or things are not
Mhm.
falling into place the way they're supposed to, and so on and so forth. But you said that you sort of become a lot more spontaneous now ever since you've been to grad school. So was it, and if you're comfortable sharing this,
Mhm.
feel free to. If not, that's totally fine. But was it like a experience, or was it something that happened over time that brought you to that realization?
I think like the spontaneity actually just came from like being away from my parents. Like as I said previously, like I came from a very strict household. And so like living on my own was great. I could eat what I want. I could eat pizza rolls every night and I was proud of it. I could make chicken nuggets for lunch every day if I wanted to. But I also started traveling. So one of my close friends had moved away from home. And because I was in Austin, they live in Houston and they were only 3 hours away. And I was like, my parents would yell at me if I just went, but they're not here and they don't have to know. And class is on Zoom. So then I started traveling by myself. I went to, I know this is going on the internet. Mom, dad, don't listen, but I went to Disney World like with my friend by myself. And it's just kind of like that realization of not, I still made plans, of course, and a schedule like I normally do, but it's kind of the realization that I don't have to be pigeonholed just to my work, and I can be spontaneous and do things that make me personally happy and like personally excited and not have to have some kind of business angle or like resume angle, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Spilling some tea
Speaking of
on
which,
this
like now you
podcast.
mentioned the fact that hey, I mean, again, if you're comfortable sharing, that's fine. If you're not, that's totally fine too.
Yeah.
Um, you said something about that spontaneity and how you've been able to sort of go out, do things that you probably wouldn't have done before because of the way that you were brought up.
Hmm.
What has that taught you? The ability to do things on your own.
I used to be really anxious about like even just staying out with friends or going out to hang out with friends too many times each week when I was at home. And it's not even like we were hanging out doing like bad things late at night. It was just like going to lunch with them or going to dinner with them. And so I don't know, it's kind of like just really taught me to like enjoy life a little more, especially because I'm in graduate school and I know I'm going to be working very soon and then I won't have all these winter breaks and stuff. It's just kind of soaking up like the last minutes of young adult freedom while I can.
Beautiful. And sort of going back to grad school and advertising, what was something that interested you about advertising in media that made you want to pursue that in UCO and then now at UT Austin and as a career?
Yeah, so I had the typical struggle of like, I don't know what major to pick. I started out as an English major just because I really enjoy writing, I enjoy literature, but I originally wanted to teach in South Korea, and my parents didn't let me. And so I was like, okay, if I can't go to South Korea to teach, what kind of major can I pursue that allows me to write, allows me to be creative? And I also have a bit of an art background. I'm just naturally like a brainstormer. I love making things happen. And so that's where my mom recommended marketing and advertising. And there's like a stereotype, sorry to any business kids out there, but that the business school is kind of dead. It's really boring. It's so like corporate America focused, whereas communications and advertising is much more fluid and much more flexible, because I can work in any industry and not just a big corporation. So that's kind of why I chose that major in undergrad. And when thinking about, okay, what specific type of master's do I want? I chose advertising. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there's advertising and public relations. Public relations is kind of things that I've already done as an undergrad, like all those events I planned, all those new concepts I made, the branding and stuff. I already felt like I experienced that, but I knew so little about advertising. All the research behind the scenes that makes good ads resonate well, all the research and analytical tools, and being like a very type A numbers person, I was like, yeah, I want to learn more about that and like how it works.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And advertising in itself is quite fascinating because of the way it has the ability to grab audiences. Now, personally, coming from India, I feel like India has a lot more creative ads in comparison to the United States, but that's just my personal outtake.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like to sort of maybe touch on, and this might let me know if this is not something that you're much aware of in terms of like the psychology of advertising, because I feel like that's very much a part of something that advertisers put out because they need to be able to tap into something inside of your head that makes you want to gravitate towards a product. So in that sense, what is something that you've learned about this aspect of the psychology of advertising and all that in your journey of that, of being a part of that program?
I am so glad you asked me this. That's exactly the area of advertising I want to go into, is finding out what can I do to connect the product or the service to you specifically. So in advertising, there's a lot of branches. If you're an art kid, if you're a writing kid, if you're a research psychology kid, there's a space for you in advertising. And what I specifically want to do is to like see what are these trends on social media, what is the conversation, interview people, focus group people, do surveys and stuff to understand why do you behave the way you do. And you may not think about it like, oh, because I do this, I buy X or Y. But I can piece that together just from my industry knowledge or other things I've read. And it's just very fun because there's some insights you never expect. Like, I remember in one of our textbooks, there was a study that showed that you tend to buy more food at the grocery store. One, when you haven't eaten because you're hungry. And so you're just like, yeah, that looks good. I'll take those Cheetos. I'll take some queso. And two, the amount of stuff you buy changes throughout the day because of your circadian rhythm. So there's a lot of like science and human elements that you don't think of that applies to your behaviors. And as a person who just loves research, I just love reading up on like the psychology and uncovering new insights about that. So if you're wondering why you're buying something, there's probably a reason I can figure out.
Let's talk about that a little more, because it's something that I find really interesting too. Like, psychology in general is quite fascinating, even though I'm not a psychology major. But anyway, in terms of what you just said about the circadian rhythm and how that influences a person's sort of tendencies to buy certain things,
Mhm.
does it do they buy more during the day than the night? How does that work?
I can't quite remember, and I don't want to be quoted incorrectly, but I believe it was like earlier in the day you would buy. I can't remember if it's earlier in the day you buy more or if at night, but it has to do with like your energy levels and kind of your behaviors, right? Because in the day that's working time, at night it's resting time. So like when do you need to eat more? It's very interesting because I think this was done by the University of Pennsylvania, if I'm remembering correctly. And one of the ways they found this out is they just looked at the receipts of different shoppers throughout the day. They worked with the store, took their catalog of consumers, and said, oh, the receipts get longer throughout the day or shorter, whichever way it was. So it's pretty cool where you can pull the data from as well.
Gotcha. And to sort of focus on advertising a little more, it's almost everywhere. Like, there's no denying. Be if you're listening to your favorite podcast, or if you're watching your favorite channel on YouTube, or just the TV in general, advertising is a huge part of the income that all of these people make.
Mm,
But what do you think, from a graduate student's perspective, is missing in the current advertising space?
ethics. Advertising and public
Hmm.
relations get a pretty bad reputation because the assumption is if we have a really shitty product, we just do anything we can to sell it. But in truth, we tell clients if we're working for them, you can't lie. Lying is not allowed. You can do puffery like, oh, we're the best tasting in the world, because we know that's just a claim, but it's not something that's like a false fact. Because, people are like, yeah, that's just an opinion. But saying some product can save a life when it doesn't have those capabilities, that it's eco-friendly when it's not, um, I think that's just something that advertising is not great at, and what a lot of us as professionals have to focus on fixing. I don't remember your original question. Sorry, I just said things and forgot.
No, 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 it's okay. That was sort of the question, in terms of what do you think is missing in the advertising space,
ah,
and that's a very valid point, because it's not something that, well, I guess it's a can of worms in terms of trying to see, because again, there's a lot of things that go behind your target audience, what you're wanting to sell, and all that sort of stuff. So I guess in advertising, nuance is out of the window. But do you think that the lack of ethics is a consequence of the more money driven or capitalistic outlook? And before I sort of let you answer that, I just want to say, capitalism, sure, it has its ills, but capitalism, like the laptop I'm using, the mic I'm using, everything is a product of capitalism. So
This is true.
in saying that, I probably would sound like a hypocrite for asking that question. But do you think that the lack of ethics is a consequence of the capitalistic nature of advertising?
I think yes, it's pretty much down to greed. How much can you pull out of people? And what will you do for money? Will you do anything? And that's where bad ethics comes in. Right now, in the Wall Street Journal, and I don't know if you're super into video games, but Blizzard Entertainment, huge problems with sexual assault scandals, misconduct in the workforce. And their personal internal PR team keeps saying, oh, we're very sorry about it. We've worked with the victims. We're trying to make the culture better. But you can see how hollow it is. And they're just trying to protect the CEO just for stocks. And that's kind of the question when protecting a brand and a product to keep your stocks and like your investments high, is that worth more than like the safety and well-being of your internal employees? Those are the kind of like advertising and public relations events, and they do happen, unfortunately, that make me feel very sick about the advertising industry. And I have a lot of friends who tell me like, Zoe, you're working in one of the most unethical industries. Why are you there? Um, but it's because I have such a passion for like ethics and diversity that I want to be the person to be able to help clean things up and instill like values and systems to prevent it from happening in the future. Because if you never step into it and try to fix it, then it's just going to keep going on its own and getting worse.
Right. Like you can do as much as you can to sort of contribute to the change, right? Because there's nothing you can do if you're just sitting on the outside and being like, that's unethical, and, just letting it happen. Because that's not going to
Exactly.
take things anywhere. It's just going to stay the way it is. Um, so it's definitely something to sort of see how that changes over time. Because with the sort of sensibilities that people are starting to get a lot more, I think things could change for the better, but then at the same time, there's also a lot of tribalism on the internet and a lot of, oh, you're with us or against us sort of mentality that can affect things, generally speaking. But do you sort of see that seeping into advertising?
Uh, yes. So a lot of brands, if you noticed, are speaking up on issues politically, in terms of economics, in terms of diversity, in terms of the environment, and it's because consumers are speaking up. They're complaining, like, your company Nestle is like littering the oceans. What are you doing about it? And because consumers hold the money, they hold some leverage and power, but companies themselves are so large at sometimes, like Nestle, they can just ignore it because they know that people are still going to buy their products. They own such a wide range of brands that you may not even know be tied to Nestle, that they know that they're going to get their money anyways. And that's kind of where the role of not just the consumer speaking up, which is great. They're getting more educated, they care more about social causes. But you need industry professionals and educated industry professionals to speak up as well. That way, it's not just, oh, the environment is a passion of mine. It's how do you have the theories to back it up? And how do you protect the investment of the company and tell them this is a good idea? So that's kind of where people who study in more academic settings, like a master's or a PhD in advertising, can have a lot more sway. And that's why I want to go so much higher in my education than just be a normal employee.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And speaking of which, like in terms of the sort of outlook, or not outlook, but the things that probably these companies do in terms of to fix their image in a certain way or to make them seem more accommodating, excuse me. um, they do a lot of things, like for example, you have certain companies changing their colors during the month of pride or so on and so forth, right?
Right.
But I remember seeing this tweet, and I probably mentioned it in another podcast previously, but we didn't dig into it as much. So if you're open to it, I'd like to sort of ponder on that a little more as we're talking about advertising. So basically, the tweet was of a few multinational companies um, that during the month of Pride had their logos colored in the flag, or in the colors of the flag, excuse me. But then on the other side was the same companies, but they're advertising in the Middle East. which had no colors of pride. Now, I can I can see both sides to the argument, or the arguments that exist, in terms of, okay, you can't necessarily advertise pride and all those sort of things to a Middle Eastern audience because of the culture. But then you can do the same in the Western world because they're more open to it. Some of us might possibly see that as like a company being hypocrite, being a company being hypocritical. But in other ways, you could also see it as a company just doing its due diligence to make sure that they're making the money. It's hard to probably draw a line in such a heavy question.
Yeah, that
But
makes
what
sense.
is your sort of outlook on that in terms of advertising and how they sort of manipulate what they show for their audiences?
So the keyword is
And in terms
audience.
of fighting for the actual cause. Sorry. Yeah,
No,
go
you're
ahead.
good. No, this makes a lot of sense, and this is something that I often get asked about. So, in terms of audience, right, you're correct that different things are shown to different countries, but even within the U.S., the same product can be shown in different style ads to different consumers. If I'm showing like a Republican, pro gun, pro life, like farmer a certain product, and I'm showing the same thing to like a young male who's like studying engineering in college in a very affluent city, the ads will naturally change. What companies will do is tailor different versions of the ads, and then the digital system will look at your profile because of cookies and third party data and show you the correct thing. Is it them being ingenuine? Not really, because they want to help communicate their product to you. But now, if we apply that to social causes, it's kind of an interesting thing of keeping the peace in politics. One example is like TikTok and stuff. A lot of companies in the US or globally will have a sister company in China that is exactly the same thing, but it's altered greatly to accommodate for the Chinese regulations, with the government and stuff. And, there's a lot more censorship and altering of things in China. So, does that mean that these social media companies aren't for free speech? Not necessarily. They're kind of just doing their duty to help reach as many people as possible without causing massive conflict. And of course, there is a business line to it, right? To not lose consumers. I imagine if you showed something super scandalous in like a more reserved country, you're gone, and probably the government would blacklist you. And while you're showing your pride in the US, it'll still look bad on you in the US just because it's a bad business move and you'll lose investors anyways. Um, but for social causes, like the companies who show their pride in the US, I don't think it's disingenuine. A lot of them are having efforts internally to make sure their employees are accommodated for, that they have a voice. And I think it's really great that these pride movements are going forward. um, I do have a caveat though, that simply changing your logo is just kind of like a show. It's really not good. It doesn't do anything besides say, I want your money to show you that I care about gay people. Uh, but what makes it unique is producing content. So, do you have employees talking about how wonderful your environment is? Are you sponsoring influencers or creators who are from like minority backgrounds, LGBTQ plus backgrounds? It's putting more action than just a logo or just saying we love Pride. That really makes it feel more genuine and shows that there's a genuine effort to support whatever social cause is going on.
Right. Very true. Very true. Because it, again, like you said, there is a lot sort of associated with it. But then at the same time, just putting up a logo doesn't necessarily show what you're actually doing for the cause. It's just performative.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably one of the reasons why people sort of are infuriated by the fact that, you can do this as a way of performance in the United States, but you're not open to sort of sending out the same message in another place.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, again, like you said, you can't necessarily call it disingenuous because at the end of the day, the bottom line also matters,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something that they need to work on. So, it's just a fascinating topic to have a conversation on, and if at any point you feel it's getting if I'm getting overindulgent with these advertising questions, please stop me. But Next thing I wanted to maybe bring up was
Mhm.
Amazon. I don't know if you've heard about this story, but uh, it's quite a story in itself of some employees having to shit in bags and so on
Ah.
to make sure that they meet their timelines and make sure that deliveries are on time,
Mhm.
or even certain instances where if they're off schedule in terms of making certain deliveries, then they get fired. But then, right after those stories came out, you had some of these ads popping up of Amazon being like, look, here's our employees. They've gone to do great things. They make a ton of money, and so on and so forth. So, as someone who's sort of like looking to work in the advertising space, what do you think is, because again, I guess optics matter,
Mhm.
but what is happening there in terms of Amazon doing that? Is that just a lack of, well, I guess decency is not the right word I'm looking for, but is it just
Ethics.
that lack of decency and sort of, sure, ethics, yes. Well, yeah, yeah, like what is happening? Does it just go back to ethics, or is there a lot more to it?
So with advertising, it just naturally falls down to business is business, money is money, and that's what the higher ups always believe, and that's what they focus on. So essentially, what's happening there is what we call like a PR crisis. Someone died on the job. There's mistreatment of employees. There's sexual misconduct, etc. And those ads are released rapidly because they're like, our image is going down. We need to respond immediately in some way. But typically, in a good crisis communication response, the first thing to do is acknowledge the situation, then apologize, show like tangible change, and then steps moving forward, right? Essentially what Amazon has done is cover it up, and we've seen a lot of companies do this where they just deny, somehow mask it, somehow cover it, and these stories have broken out, gotten considerable coverage. But from my knowledge, because I'm aware of the situation, I haven't heard or seen a like Amazon CEO or HR manager say, yeah, we're making steps to increase the break time for these employees to give them more days off. Instead, we're just getting messages, yeah, we'll pay for their college. Yeah, they get health insurance. But you can't really go to college if you're stuck in the warehouse 24/7. And you don't really need life insurance and stuff if you're kind of dead already, worked to death, essentially. So it's just really a bad case of crisis management, in my opinion. But Amazon is so big, and it's kind of one of those unfortunate like results of capitalism. It's like they have money, what can you do? They can just pay people off to cover things up. So it's really unfortunate, but that's kind of what's happening with Amazon.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's that sense of accountability, right? That's lacking, that maybe makes people question everything about Amazon. Like, anyway, I guess it'll go into a rabbit hole if I ask this next question. But to sort of flip on that sense of accountability and sort of crisis management that you mentioned,
Mhm.
I have my own sort of thoughts about the word woke culture because that has its own pitfalls too. But this might come
Mhm.
across as a woke question in some sense.
That's okay.
Do you th- do you think that advertising can go to a point where people like a Jeff Bezos or a Bill Gates can be, well, maybe not them, but the future similar ones, I guess, can be a little more accountable about the sort of dirty things that are happening behind the scenes in their companies?
So are you asking me like what role does advertising and PR have to influence the decision of like higher execs and stuff?
No, not necessarily, but well, you could answer that if you want to. But my question was more sort of a twist on what needs to change for them to be more accountable
Ah,
about everything that's
essentially,
happening.
it needs to be a solid like mass boycott of all products. And there are stages of that. Some people are like, hey, don't buy things from Kellogg's from this date to this date. The workers are on strike. We want to support them, cause the stocks to go down and stuff. And so, kind of that financial bullying, if you will, is sometimes a way to incite change. But with a brand like Amazon, it's nearly impossible to at this point because the brand has done so well and working its way into your everyday life. The convenience of Amazon Prime, the prices on Amazon Prime, and you don't realize Amazon owns a lot of other brands, Whole Foods, Twitch. Anything you do with any of their sister brands, you're supporting them indirectly. And when they're that big, to boycott or shut down something to force them to change, nearly impossible. What can happen though is they can be bullied by other companies, which sounds kind of strange, but going back to the example with the video game company Activision Blizzard being in deep trouble for not being honest, not fixing their sexual misconduct problems. Um, the CEO of PlayStation, the console where a lot of Activision Blizzard games are played on and sold, emailed Blizzard and was like, "Hey, you need to fix this. This is very unright." And because they're such a large distributor and platform where their games are played on, they're like, oh no, not only are consumers angry, but fellow companies we work with that could shut us out are angry. And so the bullying kind of has to happen, not just from the consumer level, but from the companies also in that industry in order to force change, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. That does make sense. Because I think a lot of it also has to sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe this is not the best analogy to make, but in terms of if you were to compare a company to a person, you want to seem strong. At least that's the sort of perception that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Accountability and vulnerability sort of looked at as something that sissies would do, I guess, if for the lack of a better word, where,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, things are changing. I don't want to make it seem like I'm generalizing and, not admitting the fact that things are changing. Things definitely are changing, but there
Mm-hmm.
are certain places where, it's sort of like holding strong to your positions is what's going to get you through rather than accepting what's happened and, being accountable about it.
Yeah, that's a very good point you make. And actually, that was like the very old school traditional marketing advertising tactic of where you don't say you did wrong. You said everything is perfectly fine, no one look. And I think it has to do with a lot of higher management just being a lot older. There's not a lot of younger people because nowadays you see more brands apologizing. You see more brands making like visible change in order to one accommodate what the consumers are asking for, but two, just to be very honest, what people are looking for is not just a company that makes money and gives me good stuff. They're looking kind of for brands with personality, with values that align with them, and a more humanistic like connection. So Slim Jims, Duolingo, Denny's, they use a lot of humor to show that they're human. If you've seen some of their TikToks and tweets and whatnot, and humor is one way to do it, but also being vulnerable and taking accountability for mistakes is another way to humanize a brand. And that's why in crisis cons, we so often recommend to acknowledge the situation, show next steps, and apologize versus just denying.
Right, right, exactly. Exactly. It's just interesting to sort of think about how all of these pieces sort of fall into place. But to sort of transition on into more of a lighter note, um, what is something about advertising that just makes it so relatable to people?
Well, it comes down to those research insights. What we often try to do is find the human truth. So, what that is like an insight of the why you do it that connects with everyone at some emotional level, at some like psychological level. If you saw, I'm trying to think, there was a really beautiful Nike ad with Colin Kaepernick of standing up for what you believe in, and regardless of your stance on the political spectrum, of course, it rubs some people the wrong way. But that human truth of wanting to stand up for what is right aligns with Nike very well. And so it's just something very interesting that helps people be more engaged with the story because they can understand, yeah, those are my values. I can see myself in that situation, or that was me. So whenever we're trying to sell a product, we're trying to also think, how does this fit into your life? And how do the values of the company match yours and inspire you?
Definitely. Because, like, a lot of these, what's that ad? I forget what it was. But anyway, there's multiple ads now coming into my head, and I can't necessarily pick one. But
Mm-hmm.
they have the ability to sort of generate many emotions in you because I've seen commercials where I've even teared up. I mean, I can be quite the emotional person sometimes, but
Mhm.
no, I'm quite an emotional person. I don't know why I said it that way. Anyway, um, the ability for advertisements to like elicit that emotion is beautiful in many ways because, again, like you said, it sort of humanizes the brand.
Mhm.
It sort of makes it feel like there is that connection there to where you can build that reliable bond and so on and so forth. So, speaking of that, is there a certain company or a certain or line of advertisements that you see and you're like, wow, that's a great way to sort of think, and I'd like to probably do something similar to that or maybe even better than.
Yeah. So, just to preface this, for people who aren't super familiar with advertising, the key thing that we do, despite me talking about business and money and ethics this whole time, the key word you always hear tied to advertising is storytelling. So, how do we make these ads a story? How do I use this data of how much do you buy at what time of day to craft a story of what does the consumer do in their everyday life to help inform people on how to sell the product? Um, but other times it's also just ways for the brand to connect with people to make them more enticed to buy the product. And one of my favorite storytelling commercials of all time is a Nike ad. Nike does some of the best advertising in the world, but it's not one of their sports ads. There was one for Lunar New Year, I think it was 2019, where there was like a young girl trying to hand these red envelopes with money that we usually get back to her aunt. Because, in East Asian cultures, typically you don't want to immediately accept things. You're supposed to look humble even though you want it. And it was this whole race and back and forth of the aunt and the child, like trying to give the money back and forth. And I found it hilarious. That's the kind of storytelling I want to do because it showcases a group that often doesn't get a voice in ads. It showcases a piece of culture in a really wonderful and respectful way. And 3 years just really fun and pretty. Like, despite me being an analytics and strategy person, like, I enjoy very nice things and more lighthearted things too. And sometimes that's just what a brand or the world needs. It's a story for entertainment.
Definitely, definitely. That's a very good note to sort of close off on because that sort of happy-go-lucky nature of the ad, I guess, and where they're both trying to one-up each other, and the hilarity that ensues. It's just
Mhm.
beautiful. If I can find that commercial, I'll make sure to link it in the description or in the show notes. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing everything that you did, Zoe. I really appreciate it. We're going to transition into the word association game
Oh, I'm
called Bish
ready.
Bash Bosh, where I will give you 5 different words, one word at a time,
Hmm.
and you have to respond to each of them in 3 words or 3 phrases. So, for example, if I was to say, I don't know, music, because I said this earlier when I was recording another one, what are the 3 things that sort of call out to you when I say the word music? That
Uh,
sort of thing. Does that make
yeah,
sense?
I get you. I like this. It's
Okay,
fun.
cool, cool, cool. And just for those of you who are new around here, Bish Bash Wash is basically around where I give every guest on the podcast the same 5 words just to see how they respond to them differently or similarly. So you can always check those out on Instagram as well because those clips go up on the random relatability page. But anyway, the first word for this segment is differences. What are the 3 things that sort of call out to you when you hear the word differences?
Diversity, people of color, graduate school.
I like it. The second word is nuance.
um, Subtlety, woke culture. That's a phrase. And cancel culture.
Hmm, interesting. The third word is learning.
Textbooks, pain, tears. That's
I
just
love
that's
it.
just where I am in the end of the semester. But I swear I'm a more positive person normally.
uh, fourth word is empathy.
Um, Kindness, understanding, and listening.
Beautiful. And the last word for this segment of Bish Bash Bosh is similarities.
Similarities. Friendship, peers, and diversity. I don't know if I can use a word twice, but I'm gonna.
That's fine. That is totally fine. Not a problem at all. And yeah, that was great. Thank you so much for playing along on the segment of Bish Bash Bosh. Just 2 more questions.
Mhm.
The last one's not really a question, but the penultimate question is, how do you relate to people?
That's a spicy question. Usually I do it first by listening. So as a kid, I was super introverted, and I had a lot of like super niche interests, so I couldn't connect with people that well. But as I talked to them, and they would wear like a Pokemon shirt, or they'd mention they really like watching Gossip Girl, I would pick up on those hints very fast as I listened, and then I could start a conversation and then a relationship from there. So I'd say listening is the best way to like relate to people, even if you're not naturally good at it.
Beautiful. That's awesome. For the last question, which is not really a question, but more of a request, I guess this is a space for you to be a little more positive, as you mentioned it earlier. Please feel free to share something that keeps you going every day, or just a positive thought or positive quote, whatever it may be.
Hmm. Yeah, so for me, a lot of people kind of ask, you work so hard all the time, you always seem stressed. Like, why do you do it? Is it really worth it if you're like falling apart? And I don't know, I always think the word hope is like a really good thing to cling on to, because there's a hope that this will pay off in the future, that every step you take today gives you an opportunity for tomorrow. So even if I'm dying all semester, in my head, I'm like, okay, this is going to get me a job, and that job is going to help me achieve the extracurriculars, the travel, the fun that I always wanted to have. So it's just kind of holding on to that hope in the future that things will pay off, and that's what keeps me going.
That's awesome. Hope is really a beautiful word. And as long as we're hopeful about the future and everything that we do, we'll be in good standing in some case, even though we feel like we're dying on the inside, like you said. But thank you so much, Zoe, for sharing everything that you did and taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I'm glad to chat about things, all things advertising. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, and I'll just talk about advertising all day.
Cool. That's awesome. I'll make sure to link that in the description or the show notes as well. But for those of you listening and watching, thank you so much. We'll see you guys next time.